Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Church Quarantine Week 2. I'm here in my basement with my sons here recording the message for this week, so let's jump right into it. In my professional life, I have done a lot of traveling. I've spent many nights in different hotel rooms around the country and even around the world. And it's really interesting to see lots of different cultures and different places. But one of the hardest things about doing that kind of travel and waking up in different hotel rooms is getting up in the morning and having my body adjust to the different time zones that I'm in. I'm always praying that, in the middle of the night when you wake up, I'm not going to turn over and see that it's 1:30 in the morning. I'm like, please be at least 5 o'clock in the morning. So I really try as best as I can to stay asleep, but it's really hard to adjust. And then finally, when you do get back to sleep, then your alarm goes off, and then you look over and you realize sleep time's over and it's time to get up to work. It's a really hard thing. It's that wake-up call. The wake-up call when you have to go from resting, from sleeping, from comfort into, okay, now the work needs to start. It doesn't matter how gentle the music is on that alarm clock. It's still a very jolting and often anger-inducing moment when that music goes off and you wake up from your sleep. As I think about the wake-up call, that's the kind of word that's been coming to my mind this week a lot, is the wake-up call. I'm thinking about what we're experiencing right now as families, as communities, and even as a country. And I keep thinking about that, the wake-up call. That alarm that jolts you out of a state of slumber and opens up to the reality of the world around us as it actually is. Now, obviously, not a literal sleep, but the complacency that we often have in our lives of the life as we traditionally know it. I think we've also often had times in our own lives where we've had that wake-up call, that moment of realization that things need to be different or things are different. That things about our individual lives or about the lives of our communities or our families or about our world are suddenly things that we need to reconsider. For some people, the wake-up call is a good thing. When someone's dealing with addiction and they have that all of a sudden realization that if things don't change, their life is going to fall apart, that wake-up call can be a really good thing for them. For some people, the wake-up call is bad. When you get that diagnosis that you weren't expecting from the doctor, the wake-up call that your life will never be the same is certainly something that can be quite devastating. But whenever we experience the wake-up call, that time when we get jolted out of our complacency and our slumber, our understanding about how our lives change and our need to change, we have to make a decision. How are we going to respond? Dealing with a global pandemic is a wake-up call. It's a jolt from our assumptions about how the world works, about our lives. A wake-up from the complacency that comes when we think that the world is just fine as it is, that the best of life will be experienced right now through economic prosperity with no chance of collapse, that we are safe and secure because of our money or our health or because we live in a society in which we live here in America. We get that complacency that, things in the world, they're actually not bad. They're okay. What we're going through right now, is a wake-up call. That in the world that this world, which is under the curse of sin, things are not how they're supposed to be. It's a reminder that we live in a fallen world in which disease, loss, poverty, and death are the norm, not the exception. This global pandemic, it's a wake-up call. The question is, how are we going to respond? As individuals in God's kingdom, and just as importantly, how are we going to respond as a community, the church? That's what we're going to talk about today. First, I'll say that these types of life-altering realities, these wake-up calls, are nothing new. If we look at the Bible, there are lots of times where we see people going through the wake-up call. I was thinking about this week about Daniel in the Old Testament. Daniel was a handsome young man. He was well-educated, and he served in the court of the king in Jerusalem. So he kind of had his life set up. He kind of had a vision for how it was going to work, probably have some notoriety, comfort, and wealth. He kind of had it set up. And then all of a sudden, one day the Babylonian army came and invaded and destroyed Jerusalem. And Daniel was carried off into a foreign land to serve in the court of a pagan king. That was a real wake-up call. All those visions he had had about how his life was going to be, how it was supposed to be, how the world works, were all of a sudden thrown up in the air, and he had that wake-up call that things were different. Or I think of Joseph, the father of Jesus. He was pledged to be married to Mary, And I'm sure he had a lot of dreams about how his life was going to be. He loved her deeply. I'm sure he was expecting that someday he'd have a big name in the community as he was the father of a big brood of sons and daughters. And then all of a sudden he had that wake-up call when his wife, who was a virgin, or sorry, his pledged to be woman, Mary, who was a virgin, came to him and said that she was pregnant. That's disaster. You imagine how his dreams were seemingly crushed by the news that the wife that he thought he was going to have turns out that she was pregnant. That was a terrible thing for Joseph, and his assumptions about how his life was going to live were all of a sudden under threat and potentially lost. So the question for Daniel and the question for Joseph was, what are you going to do about it? The question for us as we face this wake-up call of a global pandemic impacting our community, challenging the complacency that we feel is, what are we going to do about it? For many people in our communities, there's great fear building. They don't want to go anywhere for fear of catching the virus. People are fearful of losing their access to resources and losing their jobs. They're fearful about irreparable changes to the country. For others, the reality of pandemic is already hitting home, losing loved ones or personally facing infection themselves. Many people have already lost their jobs and are losing access to vital resources. Communities have shut down. In a world corrupted by sin, the best we might hope for is that we hunker down and hope for the best, or that we tough it out, or we try to reassure each other with phrases like, well, we're all in this together. But in the end, we don't know what tomorrow will bring and what hope there is, how long this will last, and what will the lasting impacts be of this. But here's the good news. We have not been left dealing with this wake-up call alone. There is a greater story at play than the moment we face right now. In the midst of the corruption of this world, we have not been left alone to just deal with it and tough it out. God did not leave us alone in hopelessness of a corrupt and dying world. You see, interestingly, Jesus kind of went through a bit of a sudden change himself in his own existence. God himself, God the Son, became a man and entered the world. And Philippians 2 actually says it interestingly like this, beginning at verse 6. It says, Jesus, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself. Now that must have been quite a change for the second person of the Trinity. Being God with all the attributes of the creator and sustainer of the universe, and then all of a sudden being made nothing into the likeness of a man. He humbled himself so that we would not be left alone in a world corrupted by sin. He began a ministry of restoration through his words and his actions. He came to bring hope in a world of hopelessness. And when he went to the cross, it was a wake-up call to all of creation that suffering, death, and corruption is not the end of the story. He arose victorious from the grave so that the end of our story could also be life in him, not death in sin. And he sent us his Spirit so that we would not walk through the minefield of a sinful creation alone, but we would be empowered to bring his restoration to the world and to humanity. When Daniel got shipped off to Babylon, he never returned to the life he expected in Jerusalem. But God was with him, and God worked great things through him in that land. In the first chapter of Daniel, it says that God gave him knowledge and understanding. Later on, it says that Daniel was given by God the ability to interpret dreams. God used the situation of Daniel's wake-up call to reveal himself, both to Daniel and to the people in Babylon who were lost. For Joseph, God revealed himself in a dream, and God restored Joseph with the knowledge that Mary was pregnant through the Holy Spirit, and that Joseph was to be the earthly father of the heavenly Messiah. His dreams, which were seemingly crushed, were now even greater than before. We don't know if this current global pandemic will be more like the situation with Daniel, a complete change in life that will never be reversed, although, my guess is I doubt it. But we don't know if that's what will end up happening, or if it will be like Joseph, a brief momentary scare that is quickly addressed, and life can return mostly to normal. We simply don't know what it is that we face. But the question is not what will happen. In this wake-up call, the question in this new reality is, what are we going to do about it? The answer is we need to be the church. We need to be the church. See, God has established his church as the instrument of restoration in a broken world. And that is what it has been for the last 2,000 years. We have gone through worse things than this before as a church body over the last couple of centuries. In a history of wars in humanity, the church has stepped in to bring relief to suffering people. When disease has struck remote areas, Christian medical workers have stormed in to deliver care. When natural disasters have struck, the church has stepped up. That is the history of the church over the last 2,000 years. In 1527, the bubonic plague had spread to Wittenberg, Germany. Now, Wittenberg, Germany, for those Lutheran history buffs, is where Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the wall of the church. Now, the bubonic plague is estimated to have wiped out somewhere between 30 and 60% of everybody who caught it. And the people were really scared about what was happening as the disease had infiltrated that area. A lot of the local businesses had closed. The Wittenberg University had closed. And a lot of the local pastors were looking to Martin Luther to say, what should we do? What should we say to people? And this is part of what his response said. He said, what would you do? And he was referring to the people who are sick. What would you do if it was Jesus? This I well know, that if it were Christ or his mother who were laid low by illness, everybody would be so concerned and would gladly become a servant or helper. Everyone would want to be bold and fearless. Nobody would flee, but everyone would come running. If you were to serve Christ and to wait on him very well, you have your sick neighbor close at him. Go to him and serve him, your neighbor, and you will surely find Christ in him. That is the power that the church brings to a broken world. The power to serve the world in Christ. Because in serving those who are in need, we are serving Christ himself. We see this in Matthew chapter 25, beginning at verse 34. It says, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. Those are the words of Jesus. So given our current situation, what are we going to do about it? We are to serve Christ by serving those who are most in need, knowing that through us, the church, God is working restoration to a broken world. We are his instruments to do that. So let's thank Jesus for saving us from our own hopelessness by bringing his hope to other people. Do you know people in your own lives who are fearful right now? I certainly do. Do you know some? Let's thank Jesus by giving that phone call, making a phone call to them and giving them an encouraging word. That's what the church does. Do you know someone who has lost a job? It's up to the church to help provide. Do you know someone who is sick or has lost someone? It's up to the church to provide comfort and to mourn with those who mourn. Do you know someone who thinks this is the end of economic prosperity in America and they're scared? It's up to the church to tell them about a God who gives his people citizenship in a much better kingdom than we can imagine here on earth. A kingdom where the benefits can never be taken away by sudden disaster. That is how the church responds. And if you are in the church, then you are part of that response. Ask God how you can be his personal instrument to bring hope or provision or support to people in need right now. That is the role that he has us as his people to do. Remember that in serving those most in need around us, we are serving Jesus himself, who humbled himself unto death that we could have life. In the famous trilogy Lord of the Rings, in the first movie, there's a character named Frodo, and he's given this terrible responsibility of delivering this ring into the Mount Doom, and that has all this sorts of personal problems that go along with it. And he goes to his mentor, one of his mentors, Gandalf the Wizard, and he says to him, Gandalf, I wish this ring had never come to me. I wish none of this would have ever happened." And Gandalf looks at him and says, "So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to do is decide what to do with the time that has been given to us." That's the moment we're in right now, this wake-up call for the church, a time to reminded that our hope is not in economic prosperity. Our hope is not in temporal blessings or promises of earthly peace. Our hope is in a God who came down to us and saved us from hopelessness, so that we might bring hope to a world who really needs it, especially at a time like this. This is a time to be the church. I pray that you are blessed this day and that we can all together unite together as the church and serve those who are most in need. God bless you.